Hi there, I'm Brad Stone with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm here today to talk about the role that animals played during the Civil War. They affected nearly every major aspect of the war, and I'm really fortunate to be doing it today at this wonderful farm, South Mountain Creamery in Middletown, Maryland. The farm is historic, and it's surrounded by a number of really important historic Civil War sites in this area. If you go a few miles to the east in historic Frederick, you'll see the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is an excellent place to go if you'd like to have a fun way of learning about how medical advances made in the Civil War impact us in a beneficial way even today. Nearby that is the battlefield at Monocacy, an important battle of the Civil War. Now, if you go a bit west from this farm, you'll see the battlefield of Antietam, one of the most pivotal battles of the Civil War, and not far beyond that is Harper's Ferry, another prime historic site in the United States. So all of this is in this area. If you're visiting these places, the farm here at South Mountain Creamery is a great place to stop by. You got great dairy and other food products here that you can enjoy here or bring home. So I highly recommend it. And we're really fortunate to have the owner of South Mountain Creamery here, Tony Brasco. And Tony, would you like to tell us a little bit about the history of this farm and about what people can see and experience when they come here?
Sure. So South Mountain Creamery is part of a family farm operation. I'm part of the second generation that now owns the operation with my wife, Abby, her brother Ben, and his wife Kate. The four of us own both the farm operation as well as South Mountain Creamery, which is Maryland's first on-the-farm grade A milk plant. So here on the farm, we process our own milk from our own cows. We glass bottle it, we make yogurts, ice creams, have lots of other dairy products in the store, as well as meats and eggs and things that we produce here on the farm. So folks can come out, they can try some of these farm fresh goods, they can actually visit with our cows and our calves. At certain times of the year, we open up the calf barn for folks to help bottle feed the baby calves. And yeah, so it's a good family fun operation, something that our family's pretty proud of, that we work pretty hard at.
Yeah, it's a great farm. And Tony, we were talking a little bit before about the fact that this farm is on historic land, correct?
That's absolutely correct. This field we're in here, I believe, is part of the Civil War easement, so it is preserved. It will never be developed. And this is actually our home place. So our family's been farming here for really since 1981. So that's what, like 30 years? Right, something like that.
Right.
So we're pretty happy with it.
Now, this farm is part of the area in which the Battle of South Mountain took place. It's an important battle of the Civil War. It's the first battle in which major Union and Confederate forces are clashing after Robert E. Lee invades Maryland in September of 1862. Now, the Battle of South Mountain will have a number of famous historic figures in it, including two future U.S. presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley, who will both be fighting for the Union. The battle will set up the Battle of Antietam a few days later, which is one of the pivotal battles of the Civil War and which remains the bloodiest day in U.S. history. But again, I'm really happy to be doing this presentation here on this farm with these fine animals behind us, because my talk will focus in on how animals in farms like this and in other ways really played a critical part in almost every major aspect of the Civil War. So when we talk about animals in the Civil War, they perform a number of important functions I'm going to talk about today. One is as a source of food, another as a source of important materials that are needed during the war. And they're also a very important way of transporting goods during the Civil War. And finally, they're mascots, and mascots play an important role in boosting men's morale when they're in the field. Now, I'm going to start out about talking about animals and the important role they played as a source of food. We're on a farm. As you can see, these fine beef cattle behind us. And animals were the major sources of protein and other important things like calcium and sort of basic staples that allowed the armies to survive. As Napoleon once said, an army, marches on its stomach. And, an army cannot exist unless they are adequately fed. And that's what farms like this did. A lot of people have the conception that when the Civil War started, the Confederacy was an agricultural powerhouse, whereas the North was largely just an industrial powerhouse. Now, it is true that the Confederacy has a lot of agricultural capacity. There are places like the Shenandoah Valley that are serving as breadbaskets to the Confederate armies for much of the war. But the truth is that the Union is not only an industrial powerhouse, it's also an agricultural powerhouse as well. Indeed, by the time of the Civil War, the Union in many ways is outproducing the Confederacy, both in terms of agricultural crops and in livestock. Why? Well, first of all, the Union, the North, is larger. It has more of these farms all over its territory. But the other thing is that the Union, the North, is, by the time of the Civil War, taking a much more effective, advanced approach to agriculture than the South. The South still depends largely on manual labor, and much of that, unfortunately, falls on enslaved people. The North, however, is using new agricultural practices, including much more mechanization, and they're able to produce more off of the same acreage. So by the time of the Civil War, you have a North that is both an agricultural and industrial colossus, and they're able to combine those two strengths to accomplish things that are very beneficial to the North during the Civil War, including surmounting one of the big challenges that both sides face. How do you get agricultural products, the meat or milk or eggs from farms like these to the front lines without those goods becoming spoiled? You got to remember, during the Civil War, they don't have the type of refrigeration or freezing procedures we do today. So how do you get those kind of foodstuffs to the front lines? Well, the major way at that time was through canning. Canning had been developed during the Napoleonic Wars in sort of an experimental way. But by the time of the Civil War, particularly in the North, the industry had the wherewithal to make massive quantities of canned foods. And as the war goes on, the North's capacity to produce great quantities of this canned food not only increase, but they're also able to increase the diversity of products. Everything from beef, vegetables, fruit, even some seafoods. But perhaps one of the most crucial things the North is able to provide is this. This is condensed milk. Now, we think of condensed milk today mainly as something to use in recipes, but during the Civil War, this is one of the most favorite things that a Union soldier could find in his field ration. This was developed by the Borden Company in the 1850s, but as the war goes on, the Union will put in increasing orders for this product. Why? Because it was usually the thing that many Northern soldiers preferred to drink from, just straight out of the can. It's a great drinking source for them, far better than any of the polluted water sources near their camps or battlefield. You drink this, you know it's pure. But beyond that, it has other great features. It's an excellent source of nutrition. It provides calcium, it provides protein. It contains about 1,300 calories from this one container, which is something you really need as a soldier on the march or in a battle. The other great thing about it is that it's small and easy to take with you. In addition to being a great source of nutrition, it's also sweetened. So it contains sugar, and it gives you kind of a boost when you drink it. So in some ways, it's even an early form of energy drink. So Union soldiers really valued this. And Confederate soldiers did too when they were able to capture it off of, captured Union supply wagons. But the problem with the Confederacy is that's the only way they could get this or many other canned foods. The Confederacy didn't have the industry nor the infrastructure to provide canned foods of this type. And the fact that the Confederacy didn't have this kind of supply of canned foods meant that they weren't able to consistently supply their armies with the foods they needed. The Confederate Army had an increasing problem supplying their armies as the war went on, particularly as Confederate farmlands, livestock, and other things were either captured or destroyed by Union troops. So that in turn caused conditions of near starvation or actual starvation among many Southern armies. The fact that the Confederate armies couldn't get the food supplies they needed was a major factor in the desertion rates that were starting to occur in those armies, particularly toward the end of the war. Indeed, it might be said that the Union's ability to merge its industrial and agricultural might and supply its armies, as opposed to the Confederate failure to do so, was one of the major decisive factors in the outcome of the war. Now, we talked about food. Animals also play an immensely important role in supplying some of the primary materials that were needed during the war. To start out with, wool. Wool comes from sheep, and wool was used in many, many things during the Civil War that were essential to the Army, including uniforms. The uniform I'm wearing today was made out of wool, and most uniforms worn by both sides were from wool. Wool was used in other things like blankets, gloves. Now, here again, the Union was able to couple its industrial might, its agricultural might, to dramatically outproduce the Confederacy in terms of woolen goods. In fact, the Union produced 17 times more woolen and cotton textiles than the Confederacy over the course of the war. Now, another basic material needed during the war was leather, and that comes from animal hides. And that was used for all sorts of things during the Civil War. My belt is made out of leather. My holster is made out of leather. My cap box is made out of leather. Things like saddles, reins, all sorts of critical things are made out of leather. But perhaps the most important, my boots are made out of leather. And boots and shoes were virtually all made out of leather during the Civil War. You could not put shoes on your armies unless you used leather. Once more, the Union is able to use its industrial and agricultural might to far outpace the Confederacy. In fact, the Union during the course of the Civil War produced 30 times more leather goods than the Confederacy. Now, another important thing that the armies needed was the ability to see at night. The Civil War was fought before the advent of electricity. So to see at night, you had to depend largely on candles or lanterns. Now, candles were virtually all made from animal byproducts. There was tallow with candles. Tallow candles were made from animal fat. There was also, if you want a higher quality candle, beeswax, which is a byproduct of bees. But the most popular candle at the time of the Civil War was made out of something called spermaceti, which came from whales. And speaking of whales, if you used a lamp, chances are that that would contain whale oil, also a byproduct of whales. Again, the North has an advantage. The North had a long established whaling fleet which went around the world and harvested whales. Now, since I'm with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, I have to mention that animals also provided some essential medical supplies, and perhaps the most famous would be sutures. Sutures are what you use to stitch up wounds. Now, the most favored suture of the Civil War was this. This is silk thread, which comes from silkworms. Silk thread is an excellent material to suture wounds. It's so good, in fact, that it's still used today. But the Confederacy had a problem with silk thread, and that is, at the time of the Civil War, it had to be imported from the Far East. That's no problem for the North, but it's a big problem for the South because of the Union naval blockade. And by the time of the Civil War's midpoint, the Confederacy is running out of silk thread. They have to come up with a substitute. So eventually they do. And they decide to use this instead. This is horsehair. Now, horsehair doesn't look like it would be a great suture, but there's a little bit of a backstory to all this. And that is, the Civil War is the last major war before the discovery of germ theory, the understanding that germs cause the spread of disease. And what that meant is that when surgeons did operations during the Civil War, very often they didn't wash their hands, they didn't wash their equipment, they didn't make sure that anything was germ-free. And that includes their suture material. So very often when surgeons are stitching people up with silk thread, very often that suture material could be contaminated and could infect the patient. Now, the Confederate surgeons who are thinking about using horsehair realize there's a problem with it. In its natural state, horsehair is too stiff, not pliable enough to tie into a good knot. So they got to figure out a way of making it softer, more pliable, more easily tied, and they come up with a solution. They boil it. And by boiling it, it makes it softer, more pliable, but it also does something else they don't realize. It sterilizes it. It kills off all the germs. And what they will later find out is that the Confederate surgeons who use this boiled horsehair suture end up having far fewer infections among their patients than surgeons using the silk sutures. So, just to keep your mind at ease, I mentioned before that silk sutures are used today. They are. But today, since we know about germ theory, they are sterilized and they're perfectly safe. But I do want to mention that these horsehair sutures are still also used today in some surgical procedures. So as you can see, animals supplied a lot of the basic materials that both armies depended on. Now, we've talked about food and we've talked about these important materials. The other question is, how did all these supplies get to the front lines? Well, it is true that during the Civil War, trains are being used in a major way as never before to supply all sorts of things. But still, the main burden of supplying forces in the field during the Civil War will fall on animals, and mainly what we call equines, horses and mules. Now, these animals play an incredibly important part in making sure the armies run. I'm going to use two examples, a small one and then a larger one. A small one is a Union artillery battery. That consists of just 6 cannons. In order to transport those cannons, the men, and all the materials for their operation in a battle, that will require 72 horses. Now, a larger example, I'm going to talk about Sherman's march to the sea. That's known as kind of a bare bones operation. It didn't have a large supply train. Historians, talk about the fact that it was basically performed by men foraging supplies they needed from farms and plantations as they went on the march. Well, even that bare bones operation took a tremendous number of equines. It required over 36,000 mules and 32,000 horses to transport the materials needed for that campaign. I'm talking about supply wagons, artillery, and ambulances. And then when you factor in other animals used in that campaign, other equines, horses in cavalry, horses for officers, when you combine all of that, it's about 72,000 equines. So to focus in on horses for a second, most people, when they think of horses during the Civil War, think about their use as cavalry. Cavalry is an incredibly important offensive weapon during the Civil War. Both sides use it to project force against their enemy very quickly, often by surprise. There are some epic cavalry battles during the Civil War, like those fought during the Battle of Gettysburg. The largest cavalry battle during the Civil War will be at Brandy Station. That will involve over 18,500 horsemen. It remains the largest cavalry battle ever fought on the North American continent. But as important as the cavalry was as a means of attacking your animals, what often goes overlooked is the cavalry played a critical intelligence gathering role during the Civil War. This is at a time you don't have spy satellites, spy planes, electronic means of eavesdropping on your enemy. So commanders during the Civil War would very often depend very heavily on dispatching their cavalry to find out what was going on behind enemy lines. They would send their cavalry to probe, find out what kind of troop movements were going on amongst the enemy, what their strengths, what their weaknesses were. Then these cavalry units would come back to their commanders, report on what they had seen, and that was a way for Civil War commanders to try to gauge what to do in terms of the enemy, both in terms of tactics and strategy. Now, one of the unsung heroes of the Civil War was the mule. What is a mule? Well, a mule is the hybrid when you breed a male donkey and a female horse. And what you get, in my opinion, is a remarkable animal. Although they're primarily known as pack animals, animals that can carry supplies, you can also ride them. I have in many cases, and I think they're just as good as a horse. But a mule has some added features. It is a very sure-footed animal. It can often operate in terrain and under conditions that horses don't do as well in. And it can carry a lot of material. And they were the mainstay of many a supply line during the Civil War. And even after the Civil War, our Army has depended heavily on mules in many situations. So much so that that's why they're the mascot of the U.S. Military Academy, West Point. Now, because of both armies' dependency on equines, as the war went on, they made more and more of an effort to take care of these animals, particularly the Union. Now, the Union and the Confederacy took a much different approach with regard to these animals. The Union took a more centralized approach. They would purchase these animals for their armies, whereas in the Confederacy, it was the soldier who would have to procure their own horse or mule very often. That also meant that the Union took a much more centralized approach toward the care of these animals. Indeed, by 1863, the Union has developed a veterinary corps where they have veterinary officers dispatched to cavalry units to make sure that the needs of these animals are being looked after, including their veterinary needs. Now, again, the Confederacy took a very decentralized approach with regard to the care and feeding of the animals. That largely fell to the individual soldier. As the war goes on, the Confederacy has a tougher and tougher time meeting the needs of its animals, particularly things like adequate food. Despite the best efforts of both sides during the Civil War, the war takes a terrible toll on equines. It's estimated that about 1.2 million equines died during the Civil War. It's a very sobering statistic, and it's just another insight into the devastation of this war. Now I'm going to talk about mascots. Mascots play a key function during the Civil War in terms of helping to keep up morale and instill a fighting spirit in the men. I'm going to talk about two types of mascots. One I'll call functional mascots, and the other are just pure mascots. So functional mascots are animals that do provide a service, but over time develop more and more to be considered as mascots. And perhaps the best example are goats in the Navy. Goats have been on Navy ships for a long, long time, and since the inception of the United States Navy. They were there also during the Civil War. Why? Well, goats are great sources of food, particularly milk, which you can turn into butter or cheese. Now you might say, why not use a cow? Well, a goat's a lot smaller and can fit much more easily aboard a ship. They're also very sure-footed. They don't fall on the deck and roll around. They also don't get seasick. And unlike many sailors, goats are actually excellent swimmers. Now, the other thing about goats is their upkeep is very easy. You can feed them garbage and they'll do just fine. So for all these reasons, goats are really treasured aboard Navy ships for a long, long time. Now, by the time of the Civil War, the Union Navy in particular is establishing ways of better supplying their ships with nutritious foods. So the need for live animals aboard ships is starting to diminish. But goats will remain on Navy ships long after they're needed for their use as a source of food. In fact, they'll stay on Navy ships as mascots well into the 20th century. And that's why the goat is the official mascot of the U.S. Naval Academy. Now, another set of functional animals are cats and small dogs that were used aboard ships as what would be called ratters. They would go after rats, mice, and other vermin. And they were very effective at tracking them down. They could get into small, hard-to-reach places and prevent them from doing damage to rope lines, canvas, and of course the food supply aboard the ship. So they were very valued animals. Now, one of the more famous cats was a black cat that served aboard the Union ship, the Monitor, that was involved in that epic battle of ironclads. The Monitor, a few months after that, sank, unfortunately, off the coast of North Carolina. And there was a story that the black cat that was aboard that ship either had jumped into a gun barrel and went down with the ship, or jumped onto a rescue ship and was saved. That debate never got solved until perhaps a few years ago when the ship was raised and brought in for restoration work. A few months ago, work started on the gun barrel of the ship, and the question was, would the skeletal remains of that cat be found inside the gun barrel? I'm happy to report they were not. So it is likely that the cat lived to fight another day. But the role of cats and dogs aboard these ships would continue long after the age of sail. And again, well into the 20th century, you had dogs and cats aboard Navy ships serving as mascots. Now, two of the most famous functional mascots were almost iconic. They were the horse of Robert E. Lee and the horse of Ulysses S. Grant. So Lee's horse, Traveler, was a magnificent American quarter horse. He was much loved by the men. After the war, when Lee left to assume the presidency of what's now known as Washington Lee College, he took Traveler with him. When they both died, Traveler was eventually buried on the campus, not far from where the Lee family was also buried. So General Grant's horse was Cincinnati, and he was a descendant of some of the greatest racehorses in America at the time. He was renowned for his courage in battle, and he was admired by people like Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to ride him every time he visited Grant in the field. Cincinnati is the horse that's depicted in almost every statue where Grant is mounted on horseback, including the statue that lies in front of our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Now, I'm going to talk about mascots that were pretty much just animals that were appreciated for their companionship. And they have played a very important function, again, in boosting morale. A lot of these men were far from home, and we love our pets, and they appreciated having animals that could provide companionship, and in some instances, inspire them. So one animal I'll start out with is Sally the hen. Sally belonged to Robert E. Lee. She escaped from a shipment of poultry that was being sent to the Confederate Army in 1862. And fortunately for her, she ran into Lee's tent. They hit it off, and almost every day thereafter, she would lay an egg under Lee's bed. This relationship went on until, unfortunately, the Battle of the Wilderness, when there was a misunderstanding, and Nellie, unfortunately, ended up on the menu. Lee was very upset about that. There were other animals used as mascots as well. One of the most popular were dogs. Dogs are man's best friend. Although these cows might challenge that, dogs were very often used as mascots for regiments. One of the most famous dogs was Sally the dog. Sally was the mascot of the Pennsylvania 11th Infantry, and she went everywhere with them. She paraded with them, including in front of President Lincoln. She went into battle with them. She fought with them at the Battle of Gettysburg, and there she went missing for a number of days. When they found her, she was guarding the bodies of their dead and wounded comrades. She continued to fight with them until she died in a battle in 1864. They risked their lives to save her, to bring her body back to be buried with proper military honors. But they immortalized her in 1890 when they built a monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg. And there at the base of that monument is a life-size bronze sculpture of Sally. It's a very touching tribute to the sacrifices made by dogs during the Civil War. Now, other domestic animals were used as mascots. One of the more famous was Dick the sheep. Dick was the mascot of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. And Dick could do all sorts of tricks, and he traveled extensively with the unit. Unfortunately, when they were deployed in Washington, D.C., they found out that there had been no provision made for a food supply. So they had to sell Dick in order to buy the food they needed. It was a very sad fate, but fortunately most mascots didn't suffer that. Another mascot that met a happier fate was Jeff Davis the pig, that was adopted by a Connecticut regiment. Now, he was named after Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. It was not meant as a compliment to Jefferson Davis to be compared to a pig. But Jeff Davis, the pig, was very popular among the troops, and he could do a number of things. He could march with them on his hind legs. He could smoke a pipe. He could run obstacle courses. And he served with them extensively, including when they did occupation duty in the newly captured city of New Orleans. But when it came time for them to go into combat, they made the very humane decision to send Jeff Davis back to a farm in New Haven, Connecticut, so he could live out the rest of his days in peace. Another animal that had a similar fortunate fate was Bruin the bear. He belonged to the 12th Wisconsin Infantry. And he was a tame bear. He would march with them, he would board trains with them, and he went with them on an extensive series of assignments. They ended up in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And then they got an order that they would have to take a grueling and dangerous march to Texas. Again, they made the humane decision to leave him with an arrangement in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, that he could live out the remainder of his days in peace. Now, a more common thing that very often happened is that units would adopt a mascot that was sort of the official state mascot. And that's what happened with the 26th Wisconsin Infantry. They had a badger as their mascot. Why a badger? Well, at the time, Wisconsin was known for its miners. And what better animal to symbolize miners than a badger? They can burrow deeply, and they're fierce and tenacious fighters. And they thought that by, picking a badger as their mascot, that would inspire the troops to be fierce and tenacious as well. Now, a more unusual mascot was Doug the Camel. Doug belonged to the Confederate unit, the 43rd Mississippi. And Doug represents a little known fact about the U.S. military. And that is, in the years leading up to the Civil War, as America was expanding ever westward, the Army was facing an increasing problem as to how to supply their far-flung forts and settlements. These were often over vast distances and tough terrain, stuff that even horses and mules had difficulty with. So the then Secretary of War, a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, and yes, it's the same Jefferson Davis that just a few years later would be the President of the Confederacy, came up with the idea of importing camels from the Mideast to see if they could be used to supply these far-flung forts and settlements. It was called the Texas Experiment. The idea was to create sort of an American Camel Corps. The experiment had its problems. Although those who were well trained and experienced with camels found them to be great animals to work with, others who were less trained and less experienced had difficulties with them. Now, these problems, along with the beginning of the Civil War, caused an end to the program. And unfortunately, most of these camels were just set loose to fend for themselves. Now, it is reported that some of the offspring from these camels that were just set loose were still seen roaming the Southwest up until the 1940s. But a few of the camels were still used by forces in the North and the South, and Doug was the most famous. Again, he was the mascot of the 43rd Mississippi Infantry, and he was used to transport some supplies, but he was mainly a mascot. Unfortunately, he was a rather big target, and he was killed by Union sharpshooters at Vicksburg. The men felt terrible about it. They buried him with full military honors, and there still remains a monument in honor of Doug and the services he provided to that unit. Perhaps the most famous mascot of all was Old Abe, an American bald eagle. Can't get much more American than that. He was bought from an Indian tribe by the Wisconsin 8th Infantry, and he was renowned for his courage. He was named after President Lincoln as a token of esteem for President Lincoln, and he followed the unit everywhere, including into battle. And he was known for, when a battle was raging, flying up above and giving out a warlike scream that would inspire the men. Now, Old Abe was shot twice during the war, but survived and returned to Wisconsin as a hero, not only in Wisconsin, but throughout the North. And he was given the honor of living out the rest of his days in the Wisconsin state capitol. Now, he died in the 1880s, but his legacy lived far beyond that, because in the 20th century, when the U.S. Army decided to create an airborne division, they took the likeness of Abe and used it as the insignia for that division, which today is known as the 101st Airborne Division, which is also known as the Screaming Eagles, in honor of Old Abe. Now, I talked a lot about all the ways that animals were used during the Civil War, but I'd like to conclude with one that doesn't really get that much attention, but is kind of a fascinating thing to think about. elephants could have been used in the Civil War, but were not. But some historians think they should have been. Now, what's ironic about this is the term for going into battle during the Civil War was going to see the elephant. But of course, there were no elephants during the Civil War. There could have been, however, had President Lincoln taken up the kind offer made by the King of Siam. Siam is what we call Thailand today. The King of Siam had offered Lincoln the use of elephants to show his support for the Union cause. Now, Lincoln didn't think much of the idea, and he politely declined. But some people think he was too rash in doing that. Elephants have been used for centuries by armies. They're an excellent way of transporting supplies. They're massive animals. They can carry a lot of supplies, and they can do it often over difficult terrain and under conditions that, horses and mules might not be able to. But they're also a very effective offensive weapon. They're enormous animals. They have massive tusks, and seeing them charge upon you is very intimidating. The other thing is their skin is very, very thick and made them impervious to a lot of weapons. It's believed that a lot of the sidearms or small weapons used during the Civil War probably would not have penetrated their skin, particularly if those elephants were outfitted with armor, which again is something that elephants had been equipped with for centuries by armies. Now, by the time of the Civil War, armies like those in Siam and other places would usually have men atop these elephants with rifles or rapid-fire weapons or even small artillery, which kind of made these elephants like an early form of tank. So some people think that had the Union Army been equipped with these armored elephant units, that might have had a devastating impact on the Confederate Army. Indeed, one military historian recently wrote in the publication The National Interest a very interesting story with the scenario of having an armored elephant unit of the type I described at Gettysburg, and what would have happened if an armored elephant unit had been deployed at Gettysburg. His belief is it would have crushed Lee's army to the point that they would have had to surrender, and that the war might have been shortened by 2 years. Now, would this have happened? We'll never know, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. We're concluding this presentation on animals in the Civil War here at the Monocacy battlefield, and I'm joined here by my two mascot friends, Lizzie and Winnie. And Monocacy is an important battle, as I mentioned before. It's the battle that actually saved Washington, D.C. in 1864. I'm here right next to a cavalry flag, and both sides had cavalry deployed here at Monocacy. But I'm going to talk about another cavalry action that doesn't get much attention, but I think makes for a good final story. And that is the charge of the Mule Brigade. It occurred in October of 1863 at the Battle of the Wauhatchie. That's on the border of Georgia and Tennessee. And one night, 200 Union mules were tethered together when nearby gunfire started, exploding around them. It shocked them to the point where they broke loose of their tethers and stampeded. Fortunately for the Union, they stampeded in the direction of Confederate forces under Wade Hampton. These Confederate forces saw all these, what they thought were horses, charging them. They thought it was a Union cavalry charge. They panicked, and ultimately they retreated. Now, some historians dispute how much of that stampede caused the eventual defeat of the Confederates, but it did play a factor. And the story goes that the following day, when Ulysses S. Grant was informed of this accidental victory via the mule stampede, he said he was going to promote the mules to horses. So in conclusion, I hope I've done a good job at giving you an overview of the many ways that animals played a big role in the Civil War. whether it be as a food supply, as a source of raw materials, as a way of transporting goods, and as mascots, as you can see. Animals continue to make big contributions to our military. Everything from horses and mules during Afghanistan, as noted in the film 12 Strong. We still use dogs, of course, to help protect our soldiers and to sniff out bombs. We use bees to help detect explosives. And we even use animals such as dolphins and seals to help protect our coastal defenses and for other military uses. So animals have made, throughout American history, a tremendous contribution to our armed forces. They continue to do so, and they probably will for the foreseeable future. So thank you very much for watching this. I encourage you to go to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is also in Frederick, Maryland, and better yet, get a membership to it so you can really enjoy all that it has to offer. So once again, thank you very, very much.